I'm going to introduce my colleagues who are here to my left, to your right, and then each of them is going to take a few minutes to talk about the book that they have most recently brought into the world, and then we're going to try to get a conversation going, not only among the three of them, but with you as well. So I'm going to prompt them with a few questions or observations, and let them do a little free-for-all, and then join in as soon as I ask you to come forth with questions, and hopefully we'll have a good time weaving all this together. So just next to me is Camilla Fojas, who is the author most recently of Zombies, Migrants, and Queers, Race and Crisis Capitalism in Pop Culture. She is my colleague in the Department of Media Studies, but she also teaches in the the Program of American Studies here at UVA. She is our newest colleague in Media Studies and American Studies, so just been here a few months, and we're thrilled to have her. And then just to her left, to your right, is Jack Hamilton. Jack Hamilton is also in the Department of Media Studies and the Program in American Studies. And this is his third year at UVA, so he's a veteran already. His new book is Just Around Midnight, Rock and Roll and the Racial Imagination. And he also writes for Slate magazine. You may have seen his work on music and or sports and other things in Slate. And then to his left is Glenn Frankel. Glenn Frankel is a legendary journalist who worked for many years for the Washington Post and other publications. He is the author most recently of High Noon, The Hollywood Blacklist, and the Making of an American Classic. He won a Pulitzer when he was a journalist, which is, about as nice as you can get. He has a previous book. Is this so you've done two, or if I missed that?
I've done two movie books.
Oh,
two other books.
All right. Well, this one came out a few years ago, The Searchers, The Making of an American Legend, which, as you can imagine, is a really nice companion to High Noon. That's pretty good. Pretty good set of books. So first I'm going to turn it over to Camilla to talk about what inspired Zombies, Migrants, and Queers. And, tell us all about the book.
Thank you, Siva, and I'm so honored to be part of this panel. This is actually the first time I've talked about this book, which is sort of a collection of essays that are sort of integrated as well. And the title seems maybe strange, like a lot of different things pulled together. Actually, the title changed in coordination with the editor. Originally, the title was Freefalling, and that's kind of one of the concepts in the book. This idea that after 2008, or at 2008, the entire economy had gone into a free fall, and what that meant. And so I was approaching it from two different angles. One is that all these left cultural critics are like, oh, capitalism's over, this is it, it's the end of that system, we can start anew, start fresh. And then I was looking at pop culture, and you had all of these shows that were about people who had gone into their own personal freefall. So Orange is the New Black, with Piper Chapman, who finds herself in prison and has to sort of start again in the new system. Things like Weeds, which sort of predates this, but also is about this woman who loses her house and has to sell weed in order to keep afloat. Breaking Bad is a great example. And so there are a number of these stories in pop culture of essentially white protagonists that had gone into this free fall, and free falling for them meant something else than for, say, some of the people of color that have experienced the same kind of economic devastation. So I started out by looking at that song, Free Falling. You remember that? And this whole idea of free falling. This guy is in Hollywood and he free falls and he's going to leave his girlfriend and everything's great. And free falling is this kind of experience of bliss, of being able to totally start over and to be completely free. And so what I was looking at is this idea that if you free fall, for some people, that means total freedom to start over. So in Breaking Bad, he totally starts over, makes tons of money. Doesn't turn out so good, sorry to, but this idea that it's about these new opportunities. And I don't know if anyone read this book. I think it's called How Starbucks Saved My Life. And this guy, he lost his job. He was like a director in advertising or in graphic design or interactive media. some kind, and he lost his job, and he decided that he was going to get a job at Starbucks in order to have insurance and so on. And the experience is completely enriching for him. So he meets people he would have never met. He changes the way he views life. He works with this African-American woman who completely reshifts, reshuffles the way he thinks of his world. And so he gains all of this new perspective. And so that was sort of iconic of this idea of free fall, and what it means for some people and how it means something else for others. And so that's why zombies appears in the title. Because zombies, I don't know if you remember, they kind of still are, but they're so popular. Everybody is so interested in zombie stories, and there's zombie pub crawls, and it was all about, there's even a Yahoo video about being invaded by zombie stories. Like, zombies are all around me, I can't get away from the zombie story. And I think zombies really represent this notion of starting completely over from zero. After the zombie apocalypse, you no longer have capitalism. You no longer have all of the institutions that you're used to. So I use The Walking Dead as a really good example of this, which is now totally terrifying in the new season, but nonetheless, in the beginning, people were forming new kinds of communities, new forms of consensus, and now it's sort of more about the way that capitalism sort of works to create competition and violence among the characters. And in terms of migrants, I'll just go over the title. I was looking at how migrants now are, particularly now, really visible across popular culture. So there were 2 reality shows I was looking at, or 2 reality media. One was The Queen of Versailles, if anyone has seen that, which is a documentary about this guy who's in short-term rentals, and he makes tons of money as vacation rentals. And then the economy collapses, and what becomes front and center in this documentary that's supposed to be about his family's rise to riches is this Filipino worker in his house, who is the domestic worker, whose world totally bottoms out in a way that's completely different from the main protagonist of that documentary, who in the end remakes everything, gets another loan, and so on. So what I was looking at is how, even though we believe capitalism ends and that it's this devastation of the system, capitalism is premised on cycles of ruin and reinvigoration. And so all of these stories are really about the way that capitalism is going to come back. Don't worry, the system is going to renew itself, and it has to a certain degree. And what I was trying to highlight is how it hasn't renewed itself for many people. And for those people that are left in the ruin and the devastation of this sort of free fall of capitalism, their stories are totally different. And if we look at their stories, then we might be able to rethink the social order differently, to rethink the narrative of capitalism is premised on destruction and ruin and reinvigoration, to create a new kind of course that's not as linear or premised on organic metaphors. So I guess I'll stop there because I can go on and on and on. But so I will pass, I guess, or you have your own mic, so I'll get this back to you. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah. Is there a plug for the switch? Oh yeah. Okay.
If not, this will reach. Here, I think it's
Hey, okay. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to my co-panelists. And also I want to acknowledge whoever titled this panel. I have no idea who it was for the Prince reference in pop life. So shout out to that. I'm Jack Hamilton. I'm the author of Just Around Midnight, Rock and Roll and the Racial Imagination. And this book is it's my first book, hopefully not my last. It's a book about race and popular music in the 1960s, and it is specifically about the question of how, when, and why rock and roll music became, quote unquote, became white. The best way I can describe this is that by the time Jimi Hendrix died in 1970, a lot of his obituaries thought it was totally remarkable that he was a black man playing electric rock and roll guitar in a way that no one thought was odd when Chuck Berry was pioneering that act. May he rest in peace 10, 15 years earlier. And so what accounts for that sort of generic shift in rock music? What happens in this, and particularly in a decade that we often think of as being marked by really unprecedented amounts of sort of interracial collaboration, commercial crossover, aesthetic exchange. I mean, this is the decade of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, invading America, bands who were totally steeped in African American popular music, both past and contemporary, and who were quite tireless in acknowledging those influences and shining spotlights on them. It's also the decade of Motown records, which is, or it's rather the decade of Motown's kind of commercial dominance, but, Motown, for anyone who knows about it, is Berry Gordy, an African-American entrepreneur and sort of music industry kind of veteran by the time he starts Motown. He started as a songwriter for Jackie Wilson. And Berry Gordy basically makes this bet kind of audaciously that if he markets black pop music made by black artists to white teenagers, they will buy it. As opposed to buying sort of watered down white copies as it happened in the 50s. Berry Gordy was correct. And Motown became the most successful African American business, period, in American history, and to this day, I would argue absolutely the most successful record label in the history of the world. Motown's success in the 60s is totally staggering. So while all this, and of course then there's sort of the interracial soul that's happening in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and Memphis, Tennessee, Stax and Fame and places like that. And yet at the same time, this sort of, by the end of the decade, this consensus has emerged once again that sort of white people make one kind of music and black people make another kind of music, even though, interestingly, everyone would kind of acknowledge that the music the white people are making in the 60s was started in large part by African American artists and sort of past forms of black music. And so kind of what the book is trying to do is tell a sort of interracial history of 60s music. So I consider a lot of artists kind of next to each other that don't tend to get written about in the same conversation. So for instance, the first chapter is about Bob Dylan and Sam Cooke. Bob Dylan's probably the most written about popular music artist ever, I would say. He's got almost 300 books written about him. Soon to be more. Just won the Nobel Prize in Literature, whereas Sam Cooke has had a total of 2 books written about him, neither of which are academic. And really just one academic article prior to my work. And he's one of these, a massively important musician. Sam Cooke, for people who don't know, was the first person to cross over from gospel music to the pop charts. With You Send Me in 1958, which hits number 1. And prior to that, he had been probably the most famous gospel singer in the United States. This obviously is an act that has tremendous ramifications for popular music. I mean, the number of artists who follow Sam Cooke in making this shift include, just for a few, Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, Wilson Pickett, plenty more. So thinking about Dylan and Cooke next to each other, Cooke was, to get back to the point, Sam Cooke was inspired to write what's now probably his most famous song, A Change Is Gonna Come, by hearing Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind on the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, which comes out in 1963. Sam Cooke was said to have remarked to a friend, "I can't believe a white boy wrote a song like that." And he would listen to Freewheelin' Bob Dylan over and over and over, and he writes A Change Is Gonna Come, and then is tragically murdered in December of 1964 under still kind of murky circumstances. And interestingly, when in Sam Cooke's obituaries, he's most commonly referred to as a rock and roll singer. That's how both the African American press and the white press describe Sam Cooke, rock and roll singer. Sam Cooke was murdered. Bob Dylan in 1964 would never have been described as a rock and roll singer. He's seen as a folk singer, but yet in 1965, about 6 months after Sam Cooke's death, Bob Dylan releases Like a Rolling Stone, which transitions Bob Dylan into being a full-blown rock star. And Bob Dylan is probably the single most important person in terms of sort of the ideological formation of rock music, and particularly rock criticism. And so thinking about Sam Cooke and Bob Dylan as being actually kind of in conversation with one another. And I do this other chapters as well. There's a chapter about the Beatles and Motown Records. There's a chapter about Aretha Franklin and Janis Joplin and Dusty Springfield. I've got a chapter about Jimi Hendrix, of course, and a full chapter about him and a full chapter about the Rolling Stones, who are probably, I think, Hendrix and the Stones are sort of the two most interesting characters in this particular story because of the way that they sort of fracture expectations of kind of race and sound and race and genre in the late 1960s. I too could really go on and on about this. I'm realizing this is now the 4th time in the last 48 hours that I've been talking about this book. We'll see where it goes. But I'm going to stop now and pass the microphone to Glenn.
I figured it out, I think. So my book is called High Noon. It's about the Hollywood blacklist and the making of this great American movie. I'll be really short, but first a question. How many of you have seen High Noon? And how many of you have seen a Gary Cooper movie other than High Noon? Yeah, pretty good representation. So my book begins with this classic film. As those of you who grew up in that era would know, Westerns were probably our most popular genre in the 1950s and early 60s. I mean, there's something like 1/3 of all the Hollywood movies were Westerns, and 1/4 of TV shows when TV came on. And High Noon was one of the most popular of these. It's hard to underestimate their impact. Telling stories about the American frontier kind of was a way of telling stories about our country and what a great country we were and what a moral group of people we were. And High Noon is one of these. No one expected High Noon to be an enduring classic when it came out in '52. It was made on a very low-cost budget. It was kind of the last film under an old contract for a small independent production company before they moved on to a much more lucrative contract with Columbia Pictures. It was a black and white film, and unlike many Westerns, it didn't have any beautiful landscapes or, Indian cowboy battles or stampedes or any of that. But to everybody's surprise, it sort of shot up the charts. It got wonderful reviews and started making money right away. Looking back at it now, 65 years later, you can see some of the reasons why. The acting's extraordinarily good. The script, the story is very tense and terse and moves forward with great suspense that builds over time. The characters seem a little more real than you would see in the average Hollywood movie or the average Western for that matter. The music was fabulous. The melody, Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling, which tells the narrative, very unusually, of the story from the point of view of the lawman. And finally, I think this idea of a lawman standing up to evil and overwhelming odds, even though he can't get anyone in this small town to go alongside him, is something that has great appeal somehow. And the notion of sort of, I guess you'd say, reluctant courage. The lawman doesn't want to be a martyr. He's just gotten married that morning. He'd like to go off with his new bride and start a new life, but he can't. He wants to, and he certainly doesn't want to die. But there he is, stuck. That all this made it kind of a special movie that appealed to a lot of people then. It was very popular across political lines. Dwight Eisenhower showed it 3 or 4 times and loved it. Bill Clinton says he screened it 20 times when he was in the White House. Again, something about being on your own but standing up against overwhelming odds really worked for people. But the part of it, the other part of it is, and I think the part that not many folks recall, is that High Noon was made during the time of the Hollywood blacklist and the Red Scare. And it reflects directly some of the anxieties and the pressures and the dilemmas that people faced. The guy who wrote High Noon and who basically created it, Carl Foreman, who was the screenwriter, was a former member of the Communist Party. And in the summer of 1951, when he's putting the finishing touches on the script, he's subpoenaed to testify that September. And in September, in the middle of the film shoot, he has to go before the House Un-American Activities Committee. So Carl knew by then, having watched other people be called to testify in Hollywood about the question of alleged communist infiltration of Hollywood, he knew it wouldn't be enough just to say, well, yes, I was once in the Communist Party in the late 30s and early 40s. I left. It was a terrible mistake. I'm very sorry. And that would be enough. He knew that the committee also required a sort of public rite of humiliation and self-confession, where not only would you have to confess to your own sins, but you would have to accuse other people of being communists, of being subversives. People who used to be your friends, people who were still your friends, it didn't matter. If you didn't name names, then your redemption was not going to be complete, and the next thing that was going to happen was you were going to lose your job. So my book tells the story of the making of this movie and the process that Carl and the people who he made it with, especially Fred Zinnemann, the director, and Gary Cooper, and Stanley Kramer, who was the principal owner of the small independent production company that made High Noon. Who they were, what they did together, why it was successful. At the same time, that these guys are facing this very turbulent, difficult era in American history where, you know, there's great anxiety, political anxiety out there. People are looking for someone to blame for the problems that the country is facing. We talked about, you know, Camilla talked about zombies earlier. Communists were described frequently as almost zombie-like figures in those days, superhuman, yet at the same time super scary. So the anxieties were there, the hunt for enemies was there. In those days it was communists and Jews and liberals who were the target. Today it's Muslims, it's undocumented workers, it's other folks who are singled out. Yeah. Zombies and migrants and queers. All of that. And it tells, especially filtering through Carl Foreman's eyes, the dilemma he faced in trying to decide what he was going to do. And High Noon takes on some of the coloration of his dilemma. As he's writing the end of it, he begins to identify with the lawman standing up in a small town and noticing that he doesn't have any support in that community. And then Carl finds that his friends and his business partners are sort of backing away from him, wondering what he's going to do when he finally has to go on the stand. It's a narrative telling the story through his eyes and through the eyes of Cooper and some of the other folks who face this. And it has some obvious resonances to the situation we find ourselves in today. I'll stop there.
That's a really good transition for where I was hoping to take this conversation. We have here 3 books, all about different moments in time. So Glenn uses one film to tell the deep backstory of a sad political moment in American history when people's lives were ruined, and our popular culture only slightly revealed the trauma that was going on. In retrospect, we can dig back through films of the moment and even television shows of the moment and say, oh yes, there was a subtext to this, and that's a lot of the great digging work that Glenn did here, but also interpretive work of the film itself. But in the moment, the terror was so strong in Hollywood that to tell the story straightforwardly was a risk. And then in Jack's book, you see the story of a long decade of the 1960s when rock and roll music segregates at the very moment when we are told officially that we are in the process of desegregation. And yet one of these visceral, moving parts of American life, one part of American life that is supposed to bring us all together so that we are dancing in the streets, is failing in that mission. It is resegregating. And so, you know, Jack asks himself, and asks us to ask, why in the world would that happen at that very moment? And then Camilla's looking at a moment in history that we just went through. A moment in which, if you remember just 10 years ago, we weren't sure how well we were all going to come out of that turmoil. It turned out to be a pretty intense fairly short 24 to 30 months of turmoil and crisis that many Americans are still suffering from. But remarkably, like zombies, we all stood up again and started walking around and doing the same stuff and eating the wrong things and walking mindlessly through our lives. So, what the heck did we learn from it, right? So, these books, I think, work together remarkably well, even though they take different texts and they tell different stories. They are all about three powerful moments in recent American history, the legacies of which we are still living with. And that's really what gets me to my prompt or my question here. Every book takes a few years to write, from the gestation, the moment, the question you ask, through the research and then the production, the research, the writing, and then the production. And then it emerges, if you're lucky, in the spring of 2017. But oh my gosh, when you woke up on November 9th, among all of the other thoughts going through your head, did you think that the audience for your book, the readership, would read it differently? Did you think immediately this is going to be a different book out there in the world? Let me start with Glenn and work backwards.
No, I didn't think about my book. I thought about the pickle we were all in. And,
Fair enough.
when you mentioned that, as Camilla, the period Camilla's describing was 24 to 30 months. No, I think we're still obviously suffering the consequences of that time. There's a direct link. I mean, I knew there were, I started on the book in 2013 or so, and I knew about the Tea Party and the sort of political backlash of people who felt disaffected and disinherited, rightly or wrongly, and, wanted to get their country back and felt that there were people who had usurped the country, our government, our institutions, elites, others who somehow were to blame for all this. And that echoed very much what I was seeing in the 1950s. The other thing that struck me or surprised me when I worked on the book, and now resonates even more, I think, is that our wonderful 220-year democracy turns out to be a lot more fragile than I had anticipated. And the Blacklist Era is part of that. And in the Blacklist Era, you've got all kinds of institutions, ranging from Congress and then the president and then the courts, all failing to protect the civil liberties of a large part of the population. You've got the press doing a particularly poor job and being the message carrier for the committee and for other parts of the Red Scare. You've got the Democratic Party failing and the Republican Party. So both governmental institutions and non-governmental institutions all basically folded in the face of it for many years. There were exceptions, and eventually people asserted themselves, and after a while the courts made some rulings, and President Eisenhower went after Joe McCarthy in '54. Things happened, and eventually the system sort of pulled itself back up. But the damage done, and the damage done to people who were essentially political dissidents and who were supposed to have the right to express their views, and who were not seeking the violent overthrow of the United States, the damage done was immense. And I think it was pretty clear that we are facing another challenge, and the question is, how fragile is our democracy today? And which institutions are going to stand upright and resist, defend, our democracy, and which ones are basically going to fold. So I could see that, and that was much clearer after November 9th. But, I guess we always go through these periods, but these two, the 50s and now, are very object lessons in how fragile things can really be.
Jack, was it a different book?
Oh man, so this is kind of an interesting story. I was in New York City and doing I had a reading scheduled for November 9th, which ended up being extremely lightly attended. It was like this parade of text messages from friends like an hour before, just being like, sorry, not gonna make it. But yeah, I definitely, not to wade too deeply into sort of politics, but I definitely was pretty appalled by, I think, the levels of sort of racism that were mobilized in in the presidential campaign, and real sort of like old-fashioned racism. You know, like this is really like the sort of dog whistles were put aside, and it was really ugly, and it was really troubling. And then to wake up that morning and seemingly have that type of thing affirmed. Yeah, it did make it kind of, it was like, I remember that day, I was like, the last thing I want to do right now is like go talk about, you know, Mick Jagger and Marvin Gaye for an hour. But then it was actually really great because I took my mind off it, and I was actually really glad for it. But yeah, I mean, thinking about the 60s, as itself also, you know, kind of like obviously a very tumultuous decade, very momentous, very, you know, a lot of protest, a lot of, yeah, sort of political mobilization along the lines of which I think we're seeing a bit of a resurgence of. And thinking about the way that music plays into that, something I often got asked while working on this book and have gotten asked since is like, wow, like music was so political and had such a moral conscience in the 60s, and it doesn't seem to anymore. Like that sort of declension narrative. And sort of like what happened to pop music, it used to be so good. Which I think is sort of that lament is never going to go away. But one of the things that's interesting about the 60s is like when you really get into it and start looking at the music, you realize that a lot of the music wasn't actually political, or like or we hear it now as political in a way that it didn't necessarily, you know, it was obliquely political. Like Siva just mentioned Dancing in the Street, the Martha Reeves and the Vandellas song. This came out in 1964, a Motown record. And Dancing in the Street is certainly a song that has been heard by many people, was heard by people at the time, some people, and has been heard in years since as being, you know, this great piece of kind of like politically tinged pop. And yet at the same time, Dancing in the Street is also very much a song about exactly what it sounds like. It's a song about dancing, and it's this sort of like calling out around the world, naming off all these cities in a way that was a real trope of R&B music of that period. Night Train by James Brown does the exact same thing. And so, yeah, like thinking about sort of music, the way that music functions in a lot of ways, the way that the uses people put it to. And you know, going back to someone like Bob Dylan, who, you know, his rise is as a sort of protest musician. But Bob Dylan was never exclusively a protest musician, and after 1963, really, kind of stops writing that type of music. What's that? Yeah, sure, right, okay. Occasional returns to it. You know, or like the Beatles, like, you know, we think of, I mean, John Lennon obviously was pretty active, but when you really dig into a lot of John Lennon's kind of political commentary, it's like he is really all over the place. You know, Marvin Gaye writes Inner City Blues, which is, you know, one of the great sort of statements of, you know, of kind of urban disaffection, but Inner City Blues also has like a very pointed dig at the IRS, who Marvin Gaye was beefing with his entire life. So yeah, you know, this is like, music is kind of it's an imperfect way of grappling with political realities, but it's also really powerful. Yeah, and I think that definitely, you know, in this current landscape, I've thought a lot about what music is doing right now, and also think about the limits of sort of like, you know, like there's a lot of ways for music to be useful and powerful, and it doesn't always have to be simply like an artist making a explicitly political song, and music can function other ways and be powerful and important as well. Yeah.
Which is why Dancing in the Streets would still be the national anthem if I were president.
That's the other thing. It's like Dancing in the Street is a great song. Like, are you like leaving apart, you know, any sort of like, you know, ideology you want to place on it? First and foremost, it's just a great record. And that was something that, you know, Motown certainly understood, is, you know, it's got I think the greatest recorded snare drum in all of music. It's just this enormous sounding drum. Like, next time you hear it, listen to it. It's incredible.
So when I was finishing up editing, Donald Trump was on the rise, and I thought part of his discourse was very useful to what I was starting with, which is this idea of that emanates from white nationalism, that America has fallen into the dumps because of migration, because of globalization, because of all of these things that connect the United States to the rest of the world. But I thought it was a little too light. He didn't really have a discourse. He didn't have a philosophy. And then he wasn't going to make it anyway, and I'm not going to reference it. So actually I went back to the real philosopher of white nationalism, which is Pat Buchanan, who wrote something called The Suicide of the Superpower. And he was essentially documenting this complete decline of civilization that coincides with the economic collapse. And in that, he was saying, essentially, I mean, taking his logic to its end, that in order for America to be great again, there needed to be a reinvigoration of white supremacy, or a reinvigoration of the white race. So when people say, oh, white people need to start reproducing and all of that, that's part of the white nationalist discourse that Pat Buchanan was emphasizing at the end of his book. And I was thinking about how these narratives of reinvigoration are really the narratives of capitalism. So even though, for example, we may not be at the same place that we've been, even though the stock market's doing well, but financially, or in terms of the, even just the, I guess, status of the United States, put it that way, it's sort of fallen and it's come back, but this idea of it coming back is much more of a narrative than it is actual, or at least the narrative preceded the actual reinvigoration. So it was all about making America great, becoming better, becoming a thing that it wasn't before. So there was this focus, for example, in a place like Detroit. Detroit has risen. Detroit will become the next great American city, even though it during the Great Recession was the symbol of American decline across all areas, from housing to industry to racial tensions, riots, and so on. And so now Detroit has become the symbol of this kind of rise again, and that those narratives precede actual instantiations of rise. And so I think that the story isn't just linked to the Great Recession, even though that was the greatest downfall of the economy that we've experienced, that these stories of cyclical sort of decline and reinvigoration of capitalism are ones that are ongoing, and that we're probably facing another one. The stock market can only go so high. The housing market can only get, so intense before it starts to fall again. And so I thought, oh, this story, unfortunately, is not historically bracketed, that it's actually one that has possibly new life as we live through these narratives of becoming great and falling and becoming great and falling that we're so used to in U.S. culture. So I also wanted to say, linking to other panelists, like what Glenn was looking at with the Blacklist and the idea of communism, made me think that show, The Americans, prior to 2000, prior to November 9th, was just kind of a show about Russians, and we're thinking about the Cold War, and now suddenly everyone's like, oh my God, that show is so pertinent. They called it, and it's the whole notion of the Cold War being back, I think, is really, really interesting.
So, as someone who's struggled with the identity and the role of a writer, myself as a writer, since November 8th, 2016, I'm wondering how the three of you are looking at elements of our culture, expressions of our culture, whether current or historical, and whether you see in your next work a different approach. So can you tell us about what you're working on next, and what cultural elements, what pop culture elements are going to be built into it, and what story is it going to change or tell?
Oh, the first, all right. So I'm obsessed with surveillance. And that has nothing to do with anything at all. And all of it. And I started working on this project that's really about empire and surveillance, and thinking about surveillance capacity, the way it was developed in the Philippines. The Blacklist actually started by somebody, or was really cultivated by somebody who was working in intelligence in the Philippines. all of intelligence capacity was developed there and then brought to the U.S. After World War II, or during World War II. And then and that is still something I'm working on, but then I was thinking of surveillance on the border, and these are two sort of separate projects that are working together, and thinking about the way that we have we have so many stories about the border. Even High Noon and the Searchers are really essentially westerns about the border, and I've written elsewhere about this. And there's a point also in World War II when Border Patrol shifted to become an organization that was much more intelligence-based, much more like a secretive organization like the FBI. And so that moment of that shift is something that I'm kind of thinking about a lot. And The Americans has nothing to do with it, but I'm obsessed with that show for the same kinds of reasons.
I'm working on a new book that's about music and technology over the last about roughly 50 years. And the book is it's charting the rise of what I'm currently kind of imprecisely calling inorganic musical instruments. I want to find another name. But they're basically instruments that were invented as to be replacements for people playing instruments that then became instruments that people played sort of inadvertently. So there's a chapter on the drum machine, a chapter on the digital sampler, a chapter on the synthesizer, and a chapter on auto-tune. And sort of these things that are, and I don't know if there's like, a sort of like direct political component to this. I don't know. I'll let you know.
I can give you one.
Okay.
Well, I mean, we're all deeply concerned with the replacement of our.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Yeah.
And that's an explicitly political.
Yeah. So they sort of moved to. To automation and mechanization, and yet at the same time, these are technologies where when they emerge, they all of them create these panics of sort of like, auto-tune's gonna kill singing, and the sampler, it's like they're just stealing music, or like the drum machine is gonna put all these drummers out of work. The drum machine actually the first mass marketed drum machine was made in 1959 by Wurlitzer. It was called the Sideman, and the ad copy for it is basically like, hey, now you can fire your drummer and you just lug this thing to gigs. But what's interesting is with all of these things, it's like people put them to really creative uses. And there's these stories about in the 1970s, session drummers started becoming really in demand because they were the ones who learned how to program drum machines. So you would pay a drummer to program the drum machine on your track, so the drummers are still making money. And also, all these things led to I think really interesting creative things as well. That's this sort of this attempt to get away from the human in music just really reshifts the orientation of humans, and this is something that it's nowadays, this is my little hobby is sitting around with drum machines and things like that, and it's they're not something that it's you just push a button and it plays drums. They're and that's actually something that the book is kind of interested in, is the move from the earliest drum machines are something that you push a button and it just sort of plays a rhythm. It's like rumba or bossa nova or whatever, shuffle. By the mid to late 70s, that has stopped being the case, and drum machines are programmable. They have buttons for snare, for kick, for hi-hat, for ride cymbal and things like that. And in that shift, you see the move from the drum machine being a replacement for an instrument to it being an instrument. That this is something that you now have endless amount of creative possibilities, and certainly the uses to which it's put in the 70s and particularly the 80s. A musician like Prince, who I mentioned earlier, When Doves Cry, Prince's first #1 hit, is still to this day the only #1 Billboard hit ever without an instrument playing something resembling a bass track. There's no bass on that song, and there's no instrument that's even approximating it. What it has is a Linn LM1 drum machine that's Prince put through all these filters, and the kick drum on that machine is so big and booming, and it's like he didn't need a bass. That though he submitted it to his label, and they said, "Where's the bass track?" And he was like, "Nope. Not doing it." And it became a huge hit. So that's like, but you couldn't really do that with a real drum. The art is in the synthetic. Similarly, I'm writing a lot about Stevie Wonder's 70s music with his uses of synthesizers, in which he kind of was this sort of one-man band, and getting these sounds and textures that kind of sounded like an orchestra, but also really sounded like something weird and new. And it was, Stevie Wonder, if he wanted to hire an orchestra, could have afforded to do so. But instead he was like, I want to make these sounds with my TO synthesizer. Which is this like room full of gadgets. Like a totally insane looking instrument. So that's what I'm working on now.
Glenn?
We'll have to go off the record here. Everybody's all right with that, right? So I keep coming back to writing about the relationship between popular culture, and in my case, for the most part, a sort of classic movie, a great movie, and the culture it comes from, and the political moment that it's in, and how each influences the other. And I think we can learn a lot about the movie by understanding the context of the times it was in, and by the same token, we can learn a lot about the times it was in by following the movie. And so I'm going to stick with that a little longer. Having done these 2 Hollywood Westerns, I think I'm going to do a 3rd Hollywood Western. In this case, though, it's going to be Midnight Cowboy, which is a very different kind of cowboy film. I have a friend, actually, at Texas, a fellow faculty member at Texas, who grew up at the border, and she recalls her parents going to see Midnight Cowboy in the late 1960s and thinking they were seeing a Western. They lasted until the Sylvia Miles scene, which is about 8 minutes into the movie, and then they kind of left. I don't know if they got their money back or not. Anyway, so that's how it was received in Laredo. I'm just interested in that era, and in the sort of, and what happened to Hollywood in that era, but in the country as a whole. In the 60s, but not so much writing about the Civil Rights Movement or the Vietnam War, but writing about our culture and things that were happening, and especially in New York, the changes, and how a movie like that couldn't have been made even 5 years earlier, and probably not 5 years later either. It came along at a certain moment. There are all kinds of rich themes there, and I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to land, which ones are going to be most important, but it does strike me that the flawed creative people got together. The novelist, James Hurley, who's pretty much unknown these days, and the screenwriter, a formerly blacklisted writer named Waldo Salt, and the director, John Schlesinger, a gay filmmaker from the UK, who had a few moments of glory and then faded. That all those people really interest me and how they came together, and of course the actors and other parts of it as well. So I think I'm going to have a good time with it, and that's going to be my last cowboy book.
That's wonderful. Let's open the conversation. Do you have any questions or observations from our audience? Yes.
I direct this to you, Glenn. If you tried to absorb the zeitgeist of the 50s, how did you go about steeping yourself in the popular culture? What research method did you use?
Oh, that's a really good question. I kind of count on my characters, and I follow them along, and whatever they're doing, I get to do and see what influenced them and how they were reacting to the culture. The 50s is generally, certainly the early 50s is considered this period of great social rest in America. People long to get back to it. President Trump, I think, has often talked longingly about the 50s as a time of, white male ascendancy and great prosperity and all that. Forgetting, and what I discovered, of course, delving in, is immediately you hit all of these interesting anxieties and in the culture, in the politics, these incredible conflicts, this vicious rhetoric. So I kind of approached it from the political side of things, The other thing you do is see a lot of movies. And it's a very rich era, starting in the late 40s, starting after the war, or even during the war. Hollywood is changing its, to an extent, its MO. They're making more socially conscious movies, especially in the late 40s. Gentleman's Agreement and The Best Years of Our Lives and Body and Soul. I kind of watched a whole bunch of movies starting out, and Carl Foreman, the movies that Carl Foreman wrote, and Fred Zinnemann, some of these others directed. And having movies and having movie makers involved gave me the way in. A lot of Gary Cooper movies, for that matter. So that put me into it. I'm not sure that I ever really cracked the early 50s in terms of what it really was like to live then, and what people were really influenced by outside of movies. I stuck pretty much to that, but there was so much at such a rich time that it certainly got me a lot to work on.
In the back here?
Yeah, I have a maybe overly specific question, but I wanted to direct it at each of the authors and see what it brings up. Camilla, in response to your book, I'm wondering if a television series like The Leftovers is interesting because in some ways there's loss and a sense of a society that's shaken up, but it's not necessarily at the phase of something like The Walking Dead, where you literally have almost the entire human race taken out, but rather this sort of like crisis that still exists within semi-normal capitalist functioning society. Jack, with yours, country music today, particularly the appropriation of hip-hop elements in contemporary popular country music, and then Glenn, the depiction of the communist syndicate in the film Hail Caesar. I don't know if you saw it, the Coen Brothers film, but just a response on what you thought of that portrayal. So.
Well, I have not seen The Leftovers, so thanks for making my weekend completely hijacked by a series. Yeah, it's a big one. Thank you for that.
Yeah, country music. Man, huge topic. But yeah, certainly like the incursion of hip hop elements into country is interesting. I think country is also one of the places where, you see a lot of racial issues come to the fore. I mean, I'm just thinking specifically about at the last Country Music Awards, Beyonce performed with the Dixie Chicks, and there were a lot of really angry country fans who were like, what's she doing on stage? Even though Beyonce had a country song on her last album, which was what she was performing. So yeah, I mean, one of the things that interests me about music just sort of generally is this sort of prescription of who gets to make what kind of music. And yeah, this sort of like, when you say so-and-so is not country, there's like a lot of different things that are sort of embedded in that, It's simply, but I don't honestly listen to all that much contemporary country, so I can't really get too deep into the details.
How many people here saw Hail Caesar? Yeah, pretty good turnout. The Coen Brothers are sending up everybody that they touch there, and Eddie Mannix, the main character for MGM, the fixer of everything. There really wasn't Eddie Mannix, and he really was a fixer of almost everything. He wasn't particularly anti-communist either. He wanted to fix that as well. The studios are very ambivalent during some of this Red Scare period because they really don't want these clown politicians from Washington telling them who they can hire and fire. But they're economically vulnerable. They're scared. By 1951, the Korean War is going on. A lot of things are driving the studios into submission. And they're the ones who basically invent and process the blacklist. They're the ones who enforce it. It wasn't created by the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was created by the studios in response to the committee. So, the Coen Brothers make the little commie cell look just as ridiculous as everybody else in the movie, which is only fitting. They have a wonderful ability to really focus on the most vulnerable aspect of the ridiculousnesses of Hollywood. And so, whether it's, tap dancing with all kinds of connotations to it, to the commies, they have an unerring way of mocking it. And I think they do a very good job of exposing some of the illusions, to put it gently, of the small communist group in Hollywood.
All right, next question. This gentleman over here.
I have a question for Jack, although others might want to say something in response to what you say by answering. I want to ask about your title. Am I correct in assuming it comes from Brown Sugar
Yeah, you are
by the Stones?
absolutely correct.
I would
Yeah.
love to hear you talk about why that title, what are some of the layers of meaning.
You have an hour, you'll go on.
I apologize for the
No, yeah. So it actually, that book ends, the very last part of the book is a pretty extended discussion of Brown Sugar. Brown Sugar being a Rolling Stones single from 1971 that has probably the most appalling lyrics ever written in a rock and roll song. It's a song about slavery. Yeah, slavery, violence, rape. It's pretty crazy. Yeah. So the title, a part of it, like I wanted to I feel like to write honestly about race and rock music, you have to talk about Brown Sugar. And I actually think Brown Sugar is a really interesting song because I think you can hear it on a lot of different levels. On the most basic level, you're like, it's appalling and potentially incredibly offensive. On other levels, I think it's actually a really honest grappling with history. Like, it's something that it's like, there's a lot of lines, and the Rolling Stones actually implicating themselves. I mean, one of the most pointed lines of that song is that drums beating, cold English blood runs hot. So English blood, this sort of like, the drawing attention to Britain's complicity in the transatlantic slave trade. So I think it's also a really evocative phrase, and there's a lot of 60s music with midnight imagery. I actually initially wanted to call the book In the Midnight Hour, but there's another book with that title, so I couldn't do that. But yeah, it's sort of, I kind of feel like, the book ends talking about Brown Sugar. It's the most complicated piece of music in the Stones' extremely complicated catalog. I guess I sort of, and it connotes a sort of turning point. Midnight is where the day shifts. I felt like I didn't want to shy away from that moment because it's so significant. So that's you're absolutely right that's where it comes from.
Professor Camilla, your work deals not just the U.S. You do a lot with empire building, colonialism. Do you think there's something about American culture that this isn't really well developed to deal with failure? Do you think Americans, in terms of success-oriented culture, just have really difficult work? What do, let's say, Europeans do to deal with failure?
Yeah, so this High Noon is also kind of a film that does this, where High Noon is almost citing the Alamo, which is an instance of incredible failure. Vietnam, also a failure. And the United States has an incredible, or at least the official discourse has an incredible way of re-signifying failure as success by recoding anyone involved in these failing enterprises as heroes, as wonderful, as now when the Confederacy. I mean, now when we have somebody who's in charge of this nation who does exactly that, we see it as absurd or paradoxical, but it makes sense. It's part of a narrative that we have of this re-signifying failure as a sign of hegemony, in a sense. The failures of war are no longer failures; they're really just heroicism. I hope that sort of answers your question. Thanks.
Back there?
Yeah, I think you talked about culture and the media. I think, if you look at the last presidential election, I think everybody's working from kind of a lot of falsehoods. Hillary Clinton, they say, is up by 13%. Barack Obama deported 2.5 million people, right? He's not part of racism. So I think in American media, as you can see from CNN and others, they've gotten so much wrong in the last 2 or 3 years. You see what happens in London the other day. Suppose the president takes some measures. Suppose the Russians had kept doing that, and not Muslim people. I think look at the dynamics of the last few years and how it drives culture, looks, everything. I think if you just look at the media has gotten so much wrong. And I'm not supporting Trump, I'm just saying that. I'm just saying look at the facts.
Well, that actually raises a huge question I think we're all grappling with, not just as writers, but as citizens, which is the question of trust in institutions. And at what point do institutions stretch our trust to the point of breaking? And how do you run a republic if you can't trust institutions in their grand narratives? None of us are qualified to dig into the deep data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics deals with every quarter. Right? Every quarter, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out a whole bunch of tables about the current state of working in America. And we have to be able to trust it, or we can't operate as citizens. We can't make decisions about how we want to vote. We can't even make decisions about how we might want to work without good information. And yet, whether it is a matter of internal rot within institutions or a matter of propaganda scraping away at the hull of institutions, we're at a moment when Americans have pretty much the lowest level of trust in institutions in the last 50 years. And Gallup actually does a consistent longitudinal poll on trust in institutions. And across the board, not just media institutions, but scientific institutions, state, government institutions, religious institutions are all at the lowest level of credibility and trust that they've ever measured. There may be individual stories that justify that, but collectively, we're in a lot of trouble if we have to blindly walk through the world making our own judgments based on a series of institutions we don't trust. So I'm not sure any of these books speak to that issue, but it's something that's been troubling me. I'm actually teaching a class in the fall on this very question, which is why I'm sort of obsessed with it. So thank you for the question. Yes, ma'am.
With all three of you being part of the media, do you think that the popular media today is shirking somewhat in books and movies and television and music in ignoring the breakdown in trust, or do you think capitalism is the root cause of a lot of evil? I agree, but that's not. That you go back to the 50s where they were making these movies, you look at most of the movies today, and I mean, I just watched the other night, No Country, Hell or High Water. Yeah. But I thought, it's tearing down the banks is, somewhat. And music, I have to admit, I haven't gotten out of the 60s. My music, but a lot of music you can't understand the words. And television, now I like the Americans too, but are we all just getting in our little soft cocoons and of light thinking, and then not seeing what's happening in West Virginia, coal mines?
Yeah, and I wanted to relate this to the other question, which is that we forget, we have, pop culture creates nostalgia. So now we have nostalgia for Obama. We suddenly have nostalgia for George W. Bush, who